Now, while government's promise to roll out the much-needed COVID-19 vaccine to healthcare workers as early as next month has been welcomed, many, including the governing party's leftist ally COSATU, have bemoaned the lack of clarity and accessibility of the vaccine to the majority. But acquiring the vaccine is not a straightforward matter. In fact, there are many domestic and international protocols and regulations that govern the acquisition of these life-saving medicines. To unpack these issues, I'm now joined by my panel of experts. Let's start off with the Health Justice Initiative's Fatima Hassan. She's also a former advisor to one of our health ministers. Then I'm joined by Médecins Sans Frontières' Jens Pedersen, as well as the Progressive Health Forum's Dr. Aslam Dasu. Thank you so very much for joining me. Fatima, let's start with you. The president over the weekend, when he addressed television audiences post the ANC's January 8th statement, said the following. He said the vaccine issue, like the virus, is a moving process and we must use every means possible to get the vaccine. We'll make sure that the distribution of the vaccine is flawless and that it's done according to the regulations we have. We're now facing this challenge and we will overcome it. Now, of course, that is wonderful words, but it's easier said than done. One of the things that concern me in that statement is he says, according to the regulations that are there. You recently wrote a paper or an article for the Daily Maverick where you say that this is a potential redeeming moment for the South African government because they can push for a case of compulsory licensing in the age of COVID-19. When you listen to the health minister and everyone else, do you think that government has taken this opportunity to redeem itself, or are we going to play by rules that is going to, advance big pharma, private healthcare, and the monopolies?
So thanks for having us on the show. I think the answer is no. We said in March already of 2020 that this pandemic will show all of the fault lines of how monopoly power works and how pharmaceutical pricing and access barriers will mean that we'll be last in line to access the COVID vaccine. And that's certainly the case. In 100 years, this country, South Africa, and in 25 years of democracy, our government has never issued a compulsory license for a pharmaceutical product. We thought it would do it for COVID-19 therapeutics and diagnostics, but that's not the case. So the situation we're in now is we're basically begging pharmaceutical companies for limited supplies in the global market, and we're relying on imperfect mechanisms that require volunteerism of the drug companies and also an enforcement of patents, which is what's called the COVAX facilities. So government could be acting with a lot more power. It certainly has measures available to it through the TRIPS flexibilities, through our own domestic laws, the Investment Act, the Patents Act, and of course amendments need to be passed for that to make it easier. But it's almost as if our government is acting powerless and is relying a lot on private wealth and the business sector, which is a good thing. But there's certainly measures that it can take, and for some unknown reason, it's willing to take on the tobacco and alcohol industries, but not the pharmaceutical industry, and that is quite a concern for us.
Now, one of the things, Fatima, that a government will immediately tell you is that people will not engage with us and people won't invest in these life-saving mechanisms in terms of R&D if we take the profit motive out of, the equation. What exactly can we actually do? Give me 2 or 3 examples of quick wins that government can initiate that can take, us to a situation where they can, compel people to, act in the national interest rather than in the individual, financial interests of companies.
So I think there's a few issues here. The one is that whatever South Africa is doing is really a beacon for other African countries. I mean, South Africa and India are leading a TRIPS waiver request in Geneva, and that really is giving hope to a lot of developing nations. So whatever we do here, whatever the ruling party does in South Africa, is really going to be a signal for how developing nations can also address this really pernicious form of vaccine nationalism and global shortages. So the first thing is obviously to be in the driving seat, you need to have the right negotiations negotiators on your side and the right skills, and an analysis of how you can actually make sure that you have as many supplies as possible. So one of the earliest calls in this pandemic was around solidarity and what we call the People's Vaccine campaign. And the whole idea behind freeing the vaccine is to ask drug companies to share the vaccine know-how, to have technology transfer, to not limit geographies where supplies can be manufactured in a rapid way. And then if companies refuse to actually take state action against them. So I think the point that we're at is a devastating crisis globally. We're seeing that locally. We're in a pandemic. If government is not going to take the measures available to it and to other governments in the global south, then this will never happen. And we'll still be waiting 2 or 3 years for vaccine supplies. The profit motive is an interesting one because what we've seen from reports from multiple reputable organizations, and Jens from MSF can speak to this a bit more, is that there's been substantial investment from governments and philanthropic organizations and the public into the accelerated research of vaccines. So I think the pricing transparency that we're calling for is important. It's imperative because there are a lot of myths about who actually put all the money on the table to develop some of these front-runner vaccine candidates. They relied on public institutions, on previous knowledge that was developed by HIV/AIDS and Ebola researchers. They relied on public trial subjects. We know that 4 trials were conducted in our own country. So there's a real conversation that we need to have in a reckoning around, what profit are we talking about? What R&D costs are we talking about? Drug companies are notorious for not sharing their data.
Yeah.
If necessary, we will be challenging this as well using our regulatory authorities.
All right, Jens, let me bring you in here. You've been active on a global scale campaigning, of course, for a more inclusive, more equitable, approach. There are drug companies that have indicated that, in terms of the COVID-19 vaccine, they would make it available as a public good, as opposed to for profit. Take us through the kind of global landscape, through the big monopolies. Who is coming to the party in terms of the greater public health issues, and who, are the companies that are insisting on these non-disclosure agreements so that we don't actually have transparency on what kind of financial deals are being put together to be able to access life-saving medicines in this crisis?
Thanks, Karima. I think not a lot are actually coming to the fore, to the table with regards to a public health perspective. The global dynamics of general pandemic response, vaccines, manufacturing and access in particular, is driven, as Fatima says, by corporate and by profit interest, including the research and development. The only sort of bodies we do see that champion a public health approach with regards to equitable distribution, access, is the World Health Organization. Of course, we welcome that manufacturers promise, or make promises rather, of vaccines being made available at cost. However, we don't know what it costs to develop a vaccine exactly because they won't tell us. So it's quite easy to sort of make it available at an arbitrary price of cost when we don't know what actually goes into to manufacturing. We do know, as Fatima rightly says, that a lot of the research and development is paid for by public investments, governments, foundations, in spite of manufacturers saying that they're staying clear of public funding. A large part of the early research that has led to all of this is still coming from government. The irony of this is sort of a threefold, in the sense that we have a global system of vaccine access, which is based entirely on procurement, which means that everyone is trying to buy vaccines. There is not enough supply, and not enough is being done to escalate and to expand the supply. South African and Indian TRIPS submission is one such tool, but essentially, until we manufacture our own vaccines in Africa, we are very unlikely to have an equitable distribution. The second irony is, of course, that pharmaceutical companies and others argue, as Fatima says as well, that they need patent protection to sort of protect their investments. But these investments are not their own. They're made by governments. And we have research that shows that pharmaceuticals, when they do make costs of development available, they by far exceed costs that publicly paid researchers can develop the same drugs for. Sort of the third irony in all of this is that we are relying on a system which is underwritten by monopolies. So in a globally interconnected and integrated world where we talk a lot about, including the same countries that manufacture vaccines, EU, UK, America and others, they are seeking, let's say, fair trade and equal trade agreements. In the same vein, they believe and implement monopolies when it comes to who gets to manufacture the vaccines. So the global system and the global nexus of all of these is really at its current stage as a disadvantage to low and middle income countries, African countries in particular.
All right, Aslam, let me bring you in here. I mean, you've been involved in health advocacy for many years, and particularly trying to pressurize, political parties such as the African National Congress to adopt pro-poor public health policies. If you look at the components of the vaccine rollout strategy that Dr. Willem Kiese, our health minister, has, made public, what in there gives you any kind of faith that that the matter is going to be dealt with in a way that doesn't put profits above people, that we're not going to hide behind, patent laws, and that, private health or those with access to private health are going to be the people that's going to be, first in the queue.
Hello, good afternoon, and hello to my fellow panelists. I must say, I think both Fatima and Jens have perfectly encapsulated the tensions that exist between those who want the kind of access that's been spoken about and the forces ranged against it. And it settles on two important issues, on patents and profits. And this is a struggle of decades, as both will attest to. And it is not likely to end soon, but it must be a struggle, I think, that's progressed as best possible. I think the situation right now that we find ourselves in leaves us a bit on the back foot, given that we have started quite late in the process of acquiring vaccines for our people. Looking at the rollout plan from the minister, I think first of all, we need to just perhaps show a bit of a debt of gratitude to the president for having stepped up and at least acquiring a starting pack of vaccine doses that we can start issuing. And I think together with our very hardworking minister, we are probably going to be able to secure sufficient amounts. The phased rollout is logical in that you want to get the frontline health workers in a stable situation so they stabilize the health system for the rest of us, and then to bring them on board the next phase, which is the vulnerable, and then for the rest of the population until we reach this threshold of population-wide immunity or herd immunity. And it's a really compelling approach, but it's one that we have to watch very closely because, first of all, capacity is going to be a critical thing to get right. We understand that the state is seriously incapacitated, but more than that, we have to watch the governance of this. There's certainly talks between the government and the private sector to use the private sector's logistical and financial muscle to get this program rolling, and that is all to the good. But civil society and trade unions must be at that top table, not just to sit and harangue them, no, but they bring together the most important component, the people and their voices. And of course, they should have the oversight. Can't be a cozy situation between just government and business on this one. It's far too important to just leave it to them.
Okay, Fatima, one of the big things in today's major newspapers is the question of capacity. Now, we all know that our public health system, in some cases work very well and in others very patchy. It's a very uneven setup. Given the enormity of the crisis, what needs to happen as a matter of urgency to take that patchy system, what can be done almost immediately to jack it up so that it works in partnership with other private, bodies to make the vaccine as widely available and as freely available as possible?
So I think that's a good question because a lot of the details and the plans are still not available. There's meant to be a vaccine rollout committee, and like Islam said, the important aspect is about inclusion of all different voices. I mean, we're certainly very concerned that you want to protect and vaccinate all healthcare workers and workers on the front line, but you need to consult with them more regularly and they need to be included in these decisions.
Yeah.
So obviously the issue with our public health system is that it's at strain. In many parts of the country, it's actually collapsing, and COVID, as we said in the beginning of this pandemic, will show all the fault lines of our weakening and in some cases worsening public health system. And so I do think the game changer is bringing the private sector on. And I think all of these legal cases that are being brought by groups that are trying to stop that kind of cooperation of having all medical schemes, having pharmacies, having all private GPs, having the entire business and private sector on board in a national vaccination rollout program is going to be so important. This week we saw what anti-vaxxer movements are actually planning. We saw the vaccine hesitancy increasing in our country. So I think, it's a Herculean task. I think government will be criticized on an almost daily basis, but that's par for the course because that's why they are elected representatives. So the immediate thing that we need to do is actually address the real systemic barriers globally to why we can't get immediate access to millions more dosages. I mean, 1.5 million for a 40 million plan. We're just in the beginning. And we certainly can't wait until COVAX decides they can give us, a trickle of supplies and until a drug company decides that we're worthy of their geographical market spread. So, some really urgent decisions have to be taken. We as the Health Justice Initiative, I said the one immediate thing government should do is actually revamp the Vaccine Advisory Committee.
Yes.
I certainly do think that government needs to atone for what has happened in the last few months. As you know, we were threatening them with legal action if they refused to break the silence. They did break that silence, but it's still very early days.
Jens, when you look at strategies that people deployed globally to access, ARVs, what are the lessons that we can learn, both in terms of addressing, let's say, national, regulatory problems from country to country, but also globally? How can people act in solidarity, having learned from dealing with, ARVs and the struggle to make ARVs accessible to poorer countries and the developing world?
Well, I think one thing we must keep in mind, and we did learn, is that we need to mobilize even more and faster than we did in the days to securing ARVs. In those days, it was the rich world keeping for supplies for the poor world. And what ultimately challenged that was, one, it was our patient movements that demanded medicines, and it was the ability to some extent secure cheaper medicines, which were not determined, the prices, was not determined by the manufacturers because they are set at an arbitrarily and unaffordably high level for poorer countries. So what we really learned, and this is what both Aslam and Fatima is speaking to, is the inclusion of patients, absolutely, but also more importantly, of broad societal involvement in accessing and rolling out. We do face much greater challenges at the moment because we are faced with a commodity, i.e. the vaccine, which is in very short supply, and there is an incredibly high global demand. So not only are we as a country, as South Africa, but the entire world, as you say, are applying the same sort of strategies as we are. We can either buy through manufacturers. We don't know at what cost because those costs are kept secrets. We can get via COVAX, as Fatima said, and rightly so. It's a very imperfect system. Or we can, with time and provided the right tools and measures are put in place, we can manufacture our own vaccines, which is ultimately what I hope we will get to and learn from not just HIV, but it's what we've learned from an outbreak as Ebola as well. Vaccines are still manufactured outside of Africa, for example, for Ebola as well, which is very much a disease we struggle with in Africa, and now with COVID as well. We are globally and generally in Africa, we import more than 80% of our medicines, for example, and that has to change.
All right, on that note, let's take a short break. When we come back, we look at the strategies that countries like South Africa and the continent can employ to invert that, leaning toward the north and producing life-saving medicines, in countries like South Africa. Don't go anywhere.